Okay, let's turn to Mark chapter 14. Read a few verses and skip a couple, but you can follow along or listen along, either one. Let's start with verse 41. Returning the third time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough, the hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." And as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared, and with him a crowd armed with swords and clubs, and sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." And going at once, Judas, said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him, and one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," he said, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you didn't arrest me. But the scriptures must well be fulfilled." And everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus, and when they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him in the distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, and they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave false testimony. "We heard him say, 'I'll destroy this man-made temple in 3 days, and we'll build another that's not made by men.' Yet even then their testimony did not agree. The high priest stood before them and asked Jesus, 'Are you not going to answer? What is the testimony that these men are bringing against you?' But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?' 'I am,' said Jesus, 'and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, coming on the clouds of heaven.' And the high priest tore his clothes. 'Why do we need any more witnesses?' he asked. 'You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?' And they all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some spat on him, they blindfolded him, and struck him with their fists, and said, 'Prophesy.' And the guards took him and beat him." Chapter 15, verse 1. Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin, reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "Yes, it is as you say." The chief priest accused him of many things, so again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Verse 12. "What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews?" Pilate asked him. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. And they all shouted louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them, and he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the day. We thank you for your word. We thank you for the opportunity and the freedom to study. Guide us in all things. In your Son's name. Amen. All right. We continue our study of Mark, Gospel about Jesus, written by John Mark. Last week we talked about basically Thursday of the last week of his life, which was the night of the Passover meal, his last Passover. We saw how he had gone into the city to eat this Passover meal. But before that, a woman in Bethany had anointed Jesus' head and with oil, which is like you would do coronating a king. You see, in reality, Jesus is about to become king. And at that same time, Judas had made a deal to betray Jesus with the chief priests and the Pharisees. Then he gathered with his disciples in the upper room in Jerusalem. Showed you kind of where it theoretically ought to be. The large upper room was a place where all his disciples met, not just the 12 as we traditionally think. I did. So you did. But as the pictures portray it, let me put it that way.
Where do you get that?
What?
That the disciples.
It calls the disciples, not the apostles.
But it says 12 sometimes.
Later on, it says that they were there and talks about the 12. But it also discusses the fact that the 12 were there, and then after that, the disciples went out to the garden.
He calls them the 12 disciples, or at least in my translation, he calls them the 12 disciples.
Some translations call it the 12, others just say the disciples. That's where the issue comes in. More than likely, actually, I don't know more than likely, I wasn't there. You can look at it one of the two ways. It was a large upper room. It was more than just for 12 people. It was set to have. He had a large group that was following him all day long. What?
145 is what we're given.
As far as the size of the group?
Yeah,
The room?
of the ones that were his disciples.
So it was a large room where we went, but that doesn't mean that wasn't even really the room. The idea being these people were following him around this last week, all of this large group, specifically the 12, specifically the 3. He would pull his disciples. Matter of fact, in the garden we read last week, I think it talked about that the 12 pulled away. He took them into the garden, and then he took the 3 specifically with him. So anyway. It can be either way. Basically, it's not important as much. In my mind, I see it as a larger group, but either way. Either way. Different translations do it different ways, and I'm not. Traditionally, over there, they think it was the larger group. It was his disciples. That's kind of where I understand. And that's the other thing is, to study this, I went back and forth between Mark, Luke, John, and Matthew, because each of them lists some different things that are a little bit different or whatever. So I read all 4 and tried to put them together. But I'm not really trying to go over the other Gospels, because our purpose here is not just to study the death of Christ, it's to study what Mark was trying to say. And he had a specific audience in mind, so he made specific references or whatever. Anyway, yeah.
I have always thought that there was more people there in that Mark. The difference between what he says in Mark 15 and 17 is, where was it? I'm lost. But anyway, he sent the disciples ahead to prepare the room, and then it says when Jesus arrived with the 12. So it sounds like 2 separate groups of people to me, and I have always made that assumption. I don't know why. But I'm kind of along the way you were.
Well, part of the problem is, as I see it, all through all the Gospels, there are 2 groups. There is the disciples, there is the 12 apostles that he named apostles. Sometimes he calls them apostles, sometimes he just calls them the 12. Sometimes he calls them the disciples, making specific reference to them in the context, you know that. So it's kind of which one, and so that's where your translators get in there and trying to figure out which group or whatever it does. At the end of the day, whether there was 12 or 100, it's secondary. At the point that he was arrested, there were 12. Because those 12 had separated themselves from the rest, and then 3 had gone on with him to pray. He takes these 3, which is where we start today, and he comes back and says, okay, I see the torches coming from across the Tender Valley into the garden. And he takes the 3 back and says, the time is up, time for me to betray. And brings them back to the 12, the 8, because one of them wasn't even there, it was actually 11. And brings them back to the apostles, and when Judas arrives with the crowd. And that's where we're at. Okay? All right. Some other references that come in, and this is all, some of it's outside study related to that upper room, is this. Is some believe this was John Mark's mother's house, which is where the church met right after the church was established in Pentecost, which would be a large place to meet. It's also a place that they had a connection because of Peter's connection in order to get the place and some things like that. So there's some things that weave in there that may or may not. We don't know exactly how they all fit together, but we know there's some different pins that are related, if we need to say that. All right. So here we are. He does. He has the feast, or whatever, the memorial feast, and the memorial feast is basically, and I didn't touch on this last week so much, but let's remember, he gathered together to meet with them to do what? Passover. We always talk about the Lord's Supper, because that's what he instituted, but he met for the Passover. In reality, this was the last Passover. Remember what the Passover represented? God, they put the blood of the lamb, the sacrificial lamb, on the doorpost so God would pass over them and give them life. Jesus is saying, we're having this last physical Passover because the lamb, as Hebrews is going to say, the one and final lamb that would be slain, Passover lamb, is about to be slain, and that blood, which is my blood, Jesus was saying, is what is going to be marked, and later on we'll see marked on your heart, in order that God would pass over you in that final day of judgment. That's basically what he's doing. So he's basically moving it from Jewish physical Passover, last Passover, to the one that we would remember until he comes. The one Passover lamb that forgave our sins once and for all and gave us the ability for God to pass over us and save us. So as he does that, keep that in mind and some of the symbolism that he's trying to bring across to these folks. All right. Now, Mark didn't bring that out to his audience, but that's something I wanted to mention. All right, so it says after that, they sang a hymn and went to the garden with his disciples. It took Peter, James, and John off privately to pray. Did they pray? Probably for a minute. And then they fell asleep. Jesus goes to them, and while they're asleep, he is praying. What is he praying about? What else? He's really praying about his mission as a whole, not just that night. You go to John, which we didn't. You remember in John, John writes a whole chapter, maybe a chapter and a half, about his prayers. How he prayed for himself, that this might pass. If there's any other way to make this mission forgiveness possible, God do it. He also prayed for those 12 that he was concerned about that were sleeping in the garden right there next to him, that was going to have to take this mission on and face the world. And then he went on to pray for us or anybody else that would believe because of that. So he talks about that in John there, which Mark does not. So that was part of what he was going to do. All right, before I go too far, I want to go ahead and go through some information for you before we get into the text we just read today. Right here, remember I told you they have a scale model in Israel of 1st century Jerusalem. That's what this is. So it's a scale model. You see how big it is. You see the pictures and everything there? It's pretty neat to look at. All right, as we look at this, this here is looking from east to west. That's west. This would be north. Right over here is the beautiful gate. Right here is what is called the Lion's Gate or Stephen's Gate. Today they call it Stephen's Gate. That's where he was supposedly taken out the stone outside the city. Anyway, when you come through from here on Mount Olives, which is where you're standing, viewpoint-wise, and you're down in the Kindred Valley, down here where the garden is, you come right around and you come right through that gate into the city. And then you would come in. This is the outer wall. This would be the old part of the city wall right here. Anyway, so you would come in here, and this is basically where Jesus is going to come in. Basically, it comes around where the temple is. You can't really, this is basically a cliff. Today they've got it graded, and bulldozers did a great job of putting roads in and everything right here on the edge of the Kindred Valley. But back then, it was just more like this. And that's the reason they built the city like that, so that you couldn't climb up into the city. It was on a steep wall, mount, and then the walls were very protected. So you had to come through the gate, and you would come around, And basically, you're going to come around. The upper room we talked about is traditionally located in this area. Right in here is a place called Annas' house. Caiaphas' house. They believe Annas was here. Why they believe that, I don't know. That's just what they think. Somebody thinks. Anyway, the Bible indicates through other sources that the first thing the armed crowd does is he comes, arrests him in the garden. No, we're not getting into that. Get this out of the way. All right, so they would come around here, and then they would come from right through here, over, and here's where the upper room is located in this area. They would come right in here. This is where Caiaphas' house is. All right? Caiaphas' house is where most of this trial business is going to take place for the Jews. When you look at this, over here, this area right here, you're going to find Herod's palace, which is the Praetorium. So Jesus is going to go before Pilate. And right here is where Herod's palace is, right in here, which is where he'll go before Herod. It doesn't talk about it in this particular version, but it is. This right in here would be what you see this right here is a theater, which is this right here. We're talking right in here is where Caiaphas' house is. This here is looking back. There's Mount of Olives right here, theoretically. This is looking back from the south and west, looking back. Here's your Temple Mount right here. But right here along this western side, right, this part here, this here would be Herod. When I say Herod, I mean Herod the Great. His palace, where he resided, and it's called the Praetorium, which is the place where the guard, or the governor, or Rome's guard would be stationed. And their barracks and everything would all be here. So Jesus would be brought here to be tried before Pilate. Alright, this is today's gate over the Stephen's Gate, or Lion Gate. Sign that says, see, St. Peter in whatever that is, that's basically the place where he betrayed Jesus, or what do you call it? United, which is kind of a betrayal. There's a church that was built on the grounds where this is, and this is historical in the sense that they have found, and I'm going to show you, what appears to really could have been Caiaphas' house, because they have cells, writings, all kinds of things here that basically indicate that this was first century place where they did some trials and stuff here. So anyway, they built the church there. What you're seeing is looking from there. There is the corner of the temple. There is the Mount of Olives over here. So really, there's the Garden of Gethsemane down there. So you're looking straight across to the northeast at the corner of the temple. That's the view you have. There's the Mount of Olives from that view. All right, this is on the side of a hill, as we showed you, a serious hill, and this is the courtyard that they have of this church. And right here, this is right next to it, is a first century street. This is actually a street that came to this particular location, and all these stones and everything are from that first century. That's why it's all walled off. You're not allowed to get in there because it's an architectural, archaeological site. And so this would more likely, this is correct, if this is where Jesus' trial before Cephas was, this would have been the street that he would have taken out there to do it. This is actually underneath this church building they built. This is what they have excavated. This is the rooms that they have down in this building. What you have here is some more rooms and some cells, prison cells. Here is a portrait, drawing that they found that was there describing how they would tie them up and beat them, whip them or whatever. How they had the things to tie them. Alright, this is the actual, see where these things were in the walls for them anchored tied to. Of course, it broke the currents. And this is walled off so you can't get into here. the pit where they would lower them down into the cell, basically, so they couldn't get out from the top. Here is probably nothing to you or whatever, but basically it's a location of all the things that they have found related to this particular site. All right, this here is modern day David's Gate. David's Gate is back where we just showed Herod's fortress to be, the Praetorium. This is on the grounds of that particular area, which is on the west side of the city, and the entrance there. This is just modern day. All right. Shows you that. And the last thing I'll show you real quick is this is a satellite view of Jerusalem. I tried to zoom in and everything. It's just too complicated. It's not real good, but it kind of gives you that same idea. Here's the temple. Here's City David. Here's your temple right here. Here would be the Mount of Olives. Over here is the garden. Here is where you find Caiaphas' place. And over here, they don't have it, but would be where you would find that King David's tomb is where it's right next to where they think the upper room is. What it is, I don't know. And then right over here would be where you would find Herod's palace. All right, all that said, let's get on to the important part. Okay. So with all that in mind, we go here and we find that he's resting in the garden. They come to him with an armed guard. Where does this armed guard come from? From the high priest. They had, notice it doesn't say they came in with swords, they came in with what? Clubs. Okay, they had they were only allowed to carry one bullet in their pocket. You know what I mean? In other words, they were limited in their ability to inflict force because they were part of the temple guard. So they had control over certain matters religiously, but when it came to control of the people and authority, that was retained by Rome. All right, so they come with the temple guard. They come in here, into the garden, and it says Judas greets him. How does he greet him? Rabbi. A lot of times we always talk about betraying with a kiss, because Jesus says that. But it's more than that. He says, Rabbi, and he kisses him. That is the traditional greeting that you give your mentor. The one that you're following is one of his disciples or whatever. You come up, and the term is of respect is rabbi, and you kiss them, saying, like master or whatever. And so he basically comes up and uses that, which is why it's even more significant that he comes up and says, oh, you're going to betray me by calling me your master, your mentor? We always think of a kiss as a term of affection, which it is too. And that's a bad thing, but it's more than that. He is considered his mentor, and he basically betrays his mentor. All right, so he comes up, the guards arrest him, and the disciples respond. How do they respond?
One was ready to fight.
Do what?
One was ready to fight.
One pulls out a sword. Who was it? Peter. It's interesting that the Gospel, Mark, who gets most of the information from Peter, doesn't talk to brag about that. But John tells us that it was Peter. That it was Peter. We also find that he pulls out his sword to defend him. He obviously misses. And Jesus says, we're not here to fight a war, physical war, which is what they thought they were there for. And so now he's totally confused, which I would be too, and apparently the rest were, and they all flee. The Bible says they abandoned him and they flee. One of them lost his clothes and ran away. Who was that? Probably John Mark. Probably John Mark, a young man, a writer, who would never tell on himself, was who people suppose it was. There is nothing that says it was. Outside history indicates that it was him. And so John Mark basically indicates that he fled without his clothes in order to get away. He also talks about the fact that he had linens, which is a very expensive thing, which would also indicate the wealth of his family and that they would have a place big enough in Jerusalem for the church to meet. So that also goes right hand in hand with all those things too. So we're not sure for sure, but tradition says it's John Mark and it seems to fit. And whether it is or isn't, the bottom line is they were so big in such a hurry to get out of there, they run away naked if it took it. Okay? So they get out of there and they run and they flee. We see, as I showed you before, they went from here. They came in on this side of the temple through the gate there, which is the one Stephen was stoned at, the Lion's Gate. They came in here, and then they came down here to this area right here where David's house is. Some believe Anna's house is there. Before they went there, they said basically different writers indicate they stopped and talked to Annas. Not sure whether he was there or he was already here. Annas? Who was Annas? He was the true high priest. The others were after. He was deposed because he didn't follow the political thing, I think in about 15 or 16 A.D. So he'd been out of power, out of authority for 10 or 15 minutes, but the Jews looked at him like he was the real power. Okay? Even though Rome said he wasn't. Caiaphas, which was not even one of his sons, even though they had replaced Annas with a son, like two other sons at two different times, and Caiaphas was at that particular moment, which was really a son-in-law. He wasn't even blood. But so Caiaphas was official, Annas was traditional. Jews have a tendency to go by what it is. So they basically needed Annas' blessing to go on, which he was in full agreement, basically. So here they come, and they have this trial right here. What time is it? Middle of the night. Roman law, Jewish law, can you have a trial in the night? Absolutely not. Everything about it was illegal. You could not try a person in the dark when nobody was there to defend him. That was the whole idea of it. So they met here about my night in order to have this trial. They're having the trial. And as they do so, we saw that not only did the disciples flee, but a couple follow him. All right? Anybody know who follows? Peter. Peter follows him from afar, comes in. He can't get into doesn't tell us here, but it says that he came into the courtyard, but it doesn't tell how he got in. Does anybody know how he got in the courtyard? Very quiet. Actually, they wouldn't let him pass. John tells us that John let him in. He basically had a connection that allowed him to be able to come into the courtyard. And so he says, hey, he's okay, he can come on in. And they let him in the courtyard. It's interesting, John gives us a whole lot more description about some of the things that are going on. Because John probably had better access than any of the other apostles. Side note. So we find that Peter is here, he comes into the courtyard, and he's sitting there, and he can see Jesus. They're trying him inside, everything's kind of mudded up caves and buildings made out of stone, everything tied to the walls. You can see what's going on there. And Jesus is being tried. Well, he's being tried. Peter's over here warming himself by the fire, That's what they were trying to do, stay warm while this is taking place. Now we find that Jesus is being tried, and as he's being tried here, we find that the chief priest, the high priest, along with all of them, start asking him questions. What are you doing? Where you been? What you teaching? What was Jesus' response? It doesn't record it here. It says, I walked with you daily. You know what I did. And he refused to answer questions. That's what Mark is emphasizing. He refused to acknowledge the answer. Why would Jesus do that? Two reasons. One, it was illegal for them to ask him questions. This is not where our court system where the judge asks questions. Basically, the prosecution is those who come as accusers. So they're sitting there trying to dig out of him to get him to indict himself, basically. Jesus refused to respond. Number two is, he was going to be led to slaughter like a sheep. He's already been prophesied that. And basically, Mark is going to emphasize over and over again, he would not answer. He would not defend himself one time. And you don't see him defend himself. He's not saying, yeah, but, da, da, da. He refuses to answer. So they continue to interrogate him. They don't get him to answer. And so they turn around and they try to get somebody to do what they're supposed to do, which is prosecute him. So they got people going, well, actually, a day or two ago, I saw him. He said he's going to tear down the temple, and rebuild it. And somebody else said, well, yeah, but I think he was talking about, and basically, no matter what they said, Mark tells us, they contradicted themselves, so they didn't even have an indictment on him. And so then finally it says that the high priest asked him a question. And what is he asking? Are you the Messiah? Are you the king? In Mark's version, he asked him, others talk about God, but mostly they're trying to find out, are you claiming to be the Messiah? Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One, which would be the Son of God? Are you the Christ, the Son of God? And Jesus said, I am. The only time Jesus ever answers is to say, I am the Messiah. So here he does, he says that, and of course the high priest says, that's enough, we don't need any more. What do y'all think? And they all decided he was guilty. Did they pronounce guilt on him? Yeah, no. Still night. So they turned around and they took him and they tied him up, as we saw in the cells there, and they had their guards. They beat him all night long and tortured him all night long until sunup. At sunup, the rest of the Sanhedrin joins them. Most of them were already there. The rest of the Sanhedrin joins them, and they say, okay, everybody in favor of death, blasphemy, all rise? Okay, now he's convicted. Conviction took place in daylight to make it legal. That's why chapter 15, verse 1 says, and the whole Sanhedrin gathered and determined, very early in the morning, the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. Okay? Now that they've reached a decision, he turns around, he takes him, and they take Jesus and they say, okay, so before we leave that, so the Jews have convicted him. What did they convict him of? What? Blasphemy. What is the penalty for blasphemy? Death. Death by stoning, but death. Okay?
So,
Yep.
we've heard all of the years that they didn't have the power to put him to death, that Rome had to. But they put Stephen to death
But
without Rome.
they were allowed by the Roman government to stone certain cases, but they were not allowed to crucify. Only the Romans could crucify.
So they just wanted him crucified, they didn't want him designated. Just like they didn't stone him.
Well,
Because the people were behind him.
yeah.
They wanted the Romans.
Wanted the Romans to do it was the main reason, but when it comes to, yes, the Romans controlled the power of execution. And it'll tell you right in the Bible that when they explained to Pilate what he brought it to, well, you can only be the only one that can kill him. But that's kind of a twisting of the truth. Rome allowed them to do certain things in certain circumstances, and they may have even given them the power to chase out these radicals that were following Jesus, like who did we just say? Stephen. Like Stephen and Paul, or not Paul, but all these others, whatever. So they may have given them the authority to go ahead and do that on their behalf. Or they may have said in certain religious, I don't know. The bottom line was the Jews, number one, didn't want the responsibility. Even today, they'll say we didn't do it, the Romans did it. Okay? They didn't want the responsibility. The next thing was they wanted to make sure that, I forgot. Yes.
Well, they didn't want the responsibility because they knew everything they were doing was illegal.
What?
The whole process of everything they did was illegal.
Yeah, well, they didn't want the responsibility because they also knew that all the people would come after him and cause a riot. And they knew that a riot was bad for them because then Rome would crush them. So there's a lot of reasons they didn't want to do it. Yes, sir?
So who are all the people that are screaming crucify him? If it's, they're not all the high priests and the
That's right. It's
So
the
who-
mob that they brought and gathered up to get, incite them in order to do this. That the high priest had brought in there to do it.
where did those people come from?
Oh, Jerusalem is packed at this time. Now we're daylight. All right, let's get to Pilate first. Okay? All right, so now we turn around and he sends him to Pilate because they have convicted him on blasphemy. That's the thing we want us to understand, which is a religious violation. Okay? But they bring him up here to where Pilate is. They bring him before him. Pilate says, "What are you bringing this? This is a religious matter. What are you bringing it to me for?" And they say, "You know, you're the one in charge and you got the authority." So they bring charges against him. Did they bring blasphemy charges? No. What did they charge him with? Claiming to be king. Oops. We've talked about that from the beginning of the study in Mark, how he was the king. King, 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 king. That's what Mark's trying to stress to these Roman Christians. He is king. And so here he is. He's proclaiming to be king, which is treason against Caesar, because that's a punishable by death penalty. So they push him, and we find that as Pilate interviews him, does Pilate consider him guilty? I think he says, "No, you guys got some other thing." Listen, and as a matter of fact, he calls Jesus and says, "Do you hear the charges they're making?" And Jesus just looks at him and says, "Aren't you going to answer me?" Does Jesus answer? No. So finally he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he says, "I am." John tells us, he goes on further to say, "But I'm not a king of this world. I'm a king of the next world." And here we find Pilate going, "Jesus? Really? And Barabbas? This murderous, whatever, insurrectionist, treasonous, and you calling this guy a problem?" Pilate knows good and well he's innocent. And that's what Mark is trying to stress, is that it is very clear, even to the Roman governor, that Jesus is as innocent as can be. And so we have that swap for Barabbas. And the crowd calling, "Crucify him." Well, outside of this is the morning. Things are going on. They have Barabbas in prison there. And it's like the biggest party day of the year, pretty much in Jerusalem. Everybody's there and all this. So we have a large group, which probably was incited by the Romans, got something going. I got that. They're probably there for Barabbas, You remember in Roman times how many people gathered in the Colosseum to watch people die? It's kind of like a party thing. You saw that theater I showed you? That was what that was for. It was for games, for watching. So I don't know, I wasn't there, but basically the crowd was incited to scream, "Crucify him," for Jesus.
The Middle Eastern people are fairly easy to throw us up and pick up stones even these days.
Even today they are. I don't think so.
That's for sure.
Yes, that is. Because a lot of times I go, "What?" Of course, we think different. But, anyway, so that's the situation we have. And finally Pilate says, "Fine. I will execute, crucify your king." Later on in John, we find that they want to say, wait a minute. You need to say he's not our king, but he claims to be our king. But when they went to him, they wanted to say, "Oh yeah, he's a king. He thinks he's a king. You don't want this." And so we find that through this trial, now he is condemned by the legal law of the land, even though they have no evidence, even though they think he's innocent, he is condemned to be executed. John Mark is trying to show that Jesus was innocent throughout this land. Because you see, you're trying to prove Christianity and prove these Christians in Rome to stay the course and that this is real. You need to make sure that they understand that he wasn't killed for doing something wrong. Why would you follow somebody that was just a troublemaker, that was killed and turn around and go? They're trying to say, no, this Messiah, this Jesus was something special. He's already gone through and shown all the good that he's done. And now he's talked about the betrayal, brings him up to the trial, and in the trial he's trying to say they could not prove him guilty of anything, not one thing. And in both cases, the only thing they had to stand on, the Jews had, was he said, I am the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One. And when he came before Pilate, the Roman government, all he could stand for was said, I am King of the Jews. In both cases, he was crucified or executed because he admitted that he was the Messiah, the Christ. And for that reason and that reason only. Now, Mark is trying to convince these Christians to stay the course. He said, look, Jesus' only guilt was he claimed and upon the point of death that he was the Christ, the Messiah. And that's what Mark, I think, is trying to get across more than anything as he goes through and lays out the good news of Jesus and what he does. All right, any other thoughts or questions? A lot of things we have to suppose and understand just because that's all we can do and feel. We just kind of look at the things we know and put the rest in there and kind of go from there. All right, thank you. Next week we're going to get into his death.